comes down to doing whatever you can to get chicks. At the end of the day, your purpose is kind of like, even if you're like, oh, I want to be a famous rock star, but why? So you can, He had forgotten where he was going. He hesitated in the lower corridor and then stood there idly. A little white coat appeared out of one of the doors, 3 doors away from him. It was very narrow at the waist. It was immediately familiar. Vera! She was coming his way. It wasn't far in a straight line, but she had to walk round 2 beds by the wall. Oleg, however, hadn't moved toward her. He had to think. 1 second, 2 seconds, and a third. For 3 days since her last rounds, her manner with him had been dry and official. Not one single friendly glance. At first he thought, to hell with her. He'd give as good as he got. He had no desire to bow and scrape, to look for explanations. It was a pity, though. It seemed a pity to hurt her. He was sorry for his own sake, too. Were they supposed to walk past one another like strangers? Was it his fault? It was her fault. She had deceived him about the injections. She had wished him ill. He was the one who might be unable to forgive. Unseeing, without looking at him, she came alongside, and in spite of his resolutions, Oleg found himself speaking to her quietly, as though asking a favor. Vera Kornelyevna. It was a ludicrous tone to adopt, but he enjoyed using it. She raised her cold eyes, and she saw him. No, not really. Why was he forgiving her? Vera Kornelyevna, wouldn't you like to give me another blood transfusion? It sounded as if he were groveling. Still, he was enjoying it. I thought you were refusing to take them, she said, looking at him with the same unforgiving sternness, but a kind of uncertainty trembled in her eyes, in those dear dark brown eyes. All right, I'm going to read this page over because this is like really near and dear and important to me because I want their relationship to work out. Oh man, we've all been in that spot where a girl is like ignoring you and you don't know why, and you feel like, oh, there's a good chance I'm just digging myself deeper in this hole, but I'm going to try it anyway, and even though you know you're fucking up or potentially ruining the chances of getting this girl, you talk anyway, and you still feel good because even though it's like sending that third text. I don't personally do this. It's like double texting someone you know is probably not going to respond, but on the off chance she does, you'll be like, oh my God, yes. You immediately regret it. But anyway, Vera! She was coming his way. It wasn't far in a straight line, but she had to walk round 2 beds by the wall. Oleg, however, hadn't moved toward her. He had to think. 1 second, 2 seconds, and a third. For 3 days, since her last rounds, her manner with him had been dry and official. Not one single friendly glance. At first he thought, to hell with her. He'd give as good as he got. He had no desire to bow and scrape, to look for explanations. It was a pity, though. It seemed a pity to hurt her. He was sorry for his own sake, too. Were they supposed to walk past one another like strangers? Was it his fault? It was her fault. She had deceived him about the injections. She had wished him ill. He was the one who might be unable to forgive. Unseeing, without looking at him, she came alongside, and in spite of his resolution, Oleg found himself speaking to her quietly, as though asking for a favor. Vera Kornelyevna. It was a ludicrous tone to adopt, but he enjoyed using it. She raised her cold eyes, and she saw him. No, really, why was he forgiving her? Vera Kornelyevna, would you like to give me another blood transfusion? It sounded as if he was groveling. Still, he was enjoying it. I thought you were refusing to take them, she said, looking at him with the same unforgiving sternness, but a kind of uncertainty trembled in her eyes, in those dear, dark brown eyes. All right. According to her own lights, she wasn't to blame, and they couldn't go on living in the same clinic together like complete strangers. But I liked it then. I want more, he smiled. Whenever he smiled, his scar shortened, and the line of it went all wavy. He'd forgive her now. They'd straighten it out sometime later. Still, something was stirring in his eyes, a sort of repentance. He's being a simp. Being a weak man. Come on, Oleg. Maybe they'll bring more blood tomorrow. She was still resting her hand against an invisible pillar, yet it seemed to be melting or bending under the pressure. Only it has to be you, he said. It must be you. His demand sounded heartfelt. Otherwise, I won't let them do it. She shook her head, trying not to look at him, to evade the whole issue. It depends how it works out, she said. She walked on. She was wonderful. In spite of everything, she was wonderful. Only, what was he hoping for with her? A doomed man with a life sentence. What was he trying to achieve? Oleg stood there in the corridor like a fool, trying to remember where he was going. Oh yes, he was on his way to visit Dyomka. Dyomka was lying in the tiny double room. His neighbor had been discharged, and he was expecting a new one to arrive the next day from the operating theater. Meanwhile, he was alone. A week had passed, and with it had gone the first agony of his amputated leg. The operation was receding into the past. But his leg stayed with him, torturing him as if it hadn't been removed. He could feel each toe separately. Dyomka was delighted to see Oleg and greeted him like an elder brother. Of course, they were like relatives, those friends of his from his former ward. Some of the women patients had sent him food, too. There it was on his bedside table under a napkin. None of the new arrivals could come and visit him or bring him anything. Dyomka was lying on his back, nursing his leg, or rather what remained of a leg, less than a thigh, still with his huge turban-shaped bandage, but his head and arms were free. "Well, hello, Oleg. How are you?" he said, taking Oleg's hand in his. "Sit down. Tell me how things are in the ward." The upstairs ward he'd recently left was the world he was used to. Here downstairs, the nurses and the orderlies were different, and so was the routine. There was constant bickering about who had to do what. "Well, what can you expect in the ward?" Oleg was looking at Dyomka's yellowed face. It seemed whittled, as if grooves had been planed in his cheeks. His eyebrows, nose, and chin had been planed down and sharpened. "It's still the same." "Is the personnel still there?" "Oh yes, personnel's there." "What about Vadim?" "Vadim's not too good. They didn't get the gold, and they're frightened of secondaries." Dyomka frowned his concern in a way that made Vadim, his junior. "Poor fellow," he said. "So, Dyomka, you ought to thank God they amputated yours in time. I could still get secondaries." "Oh, I don't think so. But who could tell? Even doctors. How could they detect whether the solitary destructive cells had or hadn't stolen through the darkness like landing craft? And where they had birthed? Are they giving you x-rays? They roll me in on a small cart. You've got a clear road ahead now, my friend. You must get better and get used to using a crutch." "No, it'll have to be two crutches." Poor boy. He'd already thought about everything. Even in the old days, he'd frowned like a grown man. Now he seemed to have grown even older. "Where are they going to make them for you? Right here?" "Yes, in the orthopedic wing. They'll be free of charge, at least." "Well, I've made an application. What have I got to pay with?" They sighed. The sighs came easily from them. Two men who, year in, year out, had very little to cheer them. "How are you going to finish school next year, then?" "I'll finish or bust." "What'll you live on? You can't work in the factory now." "They've promised me a disability rating. I don't know if it'll be Group 2 or Group 3. "Which one is Group 3, then?" asked Kostoglotov. He didn't understand these disability groups, or any of the other civil regulations, for that matter. "It's one of these groups, enough to buy you bread, but not enough for sugar." He was a real man, Dyomka. He'd thought of everything. The tumor was trying hard to sink him, but he was still steering his course. "Will you go to the university?" "I'll do my best. You'll study literature. That's it. Listen to me, Dyomka. I'm talking seriously. You'll just ruin yourself. Why don't you work on radio sets? It's a quiet life, and you can always earn something on the side." "Oh, to hell with radio sets," Dyomka blinked. "Truth is what I love." "Well, you can repair radio sets and tell the truth at the same time, you old fool." They couldn't agree. They argued it this way and that. They talked about Oleg's problems as well. That was another grown-up thing about Dyomka. He was interested in others. Normally, youth is only concerned with itself. Oleg spoke to him about his own situation as he might to an adult. Oh, that's awful, Dyomka mumbled. I don't reckon you'd change places with me, would you? God knows. The upshot of it all was that, what with the x-rays and the crutches, Dyomka would have to spend another 6 weeks lounging about the hospital. He would get his discharge in May. Where will you go first? I'll go straight to the zoo, said Dyomka, cheering up. He had already spoken to Oleg several times about this zoo. They would stand together on the clinic porch, and Dyomka would describe exactly where the zoo was, how it was lurking over there, across the river, behind those thick trees. He had spent years reading about animals and listening to stories about them on the radio, but he had never actually seen a fox or a bear, let alone a tiger or an elephant. He had always lived in places where there was no menagerie, circus, or forest. His cherished dream was to go out and meet the animals, and it was a dream that did not fade as he grew older. He expected something extraordinary from this encounter. On the very day he'd come to the hospital with his aching leg, the first thing he'd done was visit the zoo, only it happened to be the one day of the week it was closed. Listen, Oleg, he said, you will be discharged soon, won't you? Oleg sat there, hunching his back. Yes, I expect so. My blood won't take any more. The nausea is wearing me out. But you will go to the zoo, won't you? Dyomka couldn't let the matter go. He would have thought the worst of Oleg otherwise. Yes, I may. No, you must. I'm telling you, you must go. And you know what? Send me a postcard afterwards, will you? It'll be easy enough, for you. Wow, this is fucked up. I feel bad for this guy. Oleg sat there, hunching his back. Yes, I expect so. My blood won't take any more. The nausea's wearing me out. But you will go to the zoo, won't you? Dyomka couldn't let the matter go. He would have thought the worst of Oleg otherwise. Yes, I may. No, you must. I'm telling you, you must go. And you know what? Send me a postcard afterwards, will you? It'll be easy enough for you, and it'll give me such pleasure. Write and tell me what animals they have now and which is the most interesting, all right? Then I'll know a month before they let me out. You will go, won't you? And write me? They say they have crocodiles and lions and... Oleg promised. He left the room to go lie down himself, leaving Dyomka alone in the small room with the door closed. For a long time, Dyomka didn't pick up his book. He just looked at the ceiling and through the window and thought. He couldn't see anything through the window. Its bars converged into one corner, and it looked out on a nondescript corner of the yard, bounded by the wall of the medical center. There was not even a strip of direct sunlight on the wall now, but it wasn't an overcast day either. The sun was slightly veiled, not completely covered by clouds, and gave out a sort of diffused angular light. It must have been one of those dullish days, not too hot and not too bright, when spring was doing her work without undue fuss or noise. Dyomka lay motionless, thinking pleasant thoughts. How he'd learned to walk on crutches, briskly and smartly. How one really summery day, shortly before May Day, he'd go out and explore the zoo from morning until the evening train. How he'd have plenty of time now to get quickly through his subjects at school, and do well and read all the essential books he'd hitherto missed. There would be no more wasted evenings with the other boys going off to the dance hall after tormenting himself about whether to go or not, even though he couldn't dance anyway. No more of that. He would just turn on his light and work at his books. There was a knock at the door. "Come in," said Dyomka. Saying "come in" gave him a feeling of satisfaction. He had never known a situation where people had to knock at his door before entering. The door flung open, letting in Asya. Asya came in, or rather burst in. She rushed into the room, as though someone was chasing her, pushed the door shut behind her and stood there by the door, one hand on the knob, the other holding the front of her dressing gown together. She was no longer the Asya who had dropped in for a 3-day checkup, who was expecting back in a few days' time by her track friends at the winter stadium. She had snagged and faded. Even her yellow hair, which couldn't change as quickly as the rest of her, hung down pitifully now. She was wearing the same dressing gown, an unpleasant one, with goodness knows what boilers. It looked more becoming of her now than before. Asya looked at Dyomka, and her eyelashes trembled a little. Had she come to the right place? Would she have to rush on somewhere else? She was utterly crushed now. No longer Dyomka's senior by a full year in school, she had lost her advantage of extra experience, her knowledge of life and the 3 long journeys she had made. She seemed to Dyomka almost like part of him. He was very pleased to see her. "Asya, sit down, what's the matter?" he said. They had had many talks together in the hospital. They had discussed his leg. Asya had come out firmly against giving it up. After the operation, she had come to see him twice, brought him apples and cookies. Natural though their friendship had been that first evening, it had since become even more so. And she'd told him, although not all at once, exactly what was wrong with her. She had had a pain in her right breast. They had found some sort of hard lumps in it. They were giving her x-ray treatment for it and making her put pills under her tongue. "Sit down, Asya, sit down." She let go of the doorknob and walked a few steps to the stool at the head of Dyomka's bed, dragging her hand behind her along the door, along the wall. It was as though she had to hold on to them and grope her way. She sat down and didn't look Dyomka in the eye. She looked past him, at the blanket. She wouldn't turn to face him, and he couldn't twist his body round to see her directly either. "Come on now, what's the matter?" He had to play the older man again. That was his role. He threw his head back, craning his neck over the pile of pillows so that he could see her, still lying on his back. Her lip trembled, her eyelashes fluttered. "Asya Sienka!" Dyomka just had time to say the word. He was overcome with pity for her. He wouldn't have dared call her Asya otherwise. Suddenly, she threw herself onto his pillow, her head against his, her little sheaf of hair tickling his ear. "Please, Asyenka," he begged her, fumbling over the blanket for her hand. But he couldn't see her hand, and so he didn't find it. She sobbed into the pillow. "What is it? Come on, tell me, what is it?" But he'd almost guessed what it was. "They're going to cut it off." She cried, and she cried. And then she started to groan. "Oh, oh!" Dyomka couldn't remember ever hearing such a long, drawn-out moan of grief. Such an extraordinary sound as this, "Oh, oh, oh." "Maybe they won't do it after all," he said, trying to soothe her. "Maybe they won't have to." But he knew somehow that his words wouldn't be enough to comfort her sorrow. She cried and cried into his pillow. He could feel the place beside him. It was already quite wet. Dyomka found her hand and began to stroke it. "Asyenka," he said, "maybe they won't have to." They will! They're going to do it on Friday!" And she let out such a groan that it transfixed Dyomka's soul. He couldn't see her tear-stained face. A few locks of hair found their way through to his eyes. It was soft hair, soft and ticklish. Dyomka searched for words, but they wouldn't come. All he could do was clasp her hand tighter and tighter to try to stop her. He had more pity for her than he had ever had for himself. "What have I got to live for?" she sobbed. Dyomka's experiences, vague as they were, provided him with an answer to this question, but he couldn't express it. Even if he could have done, Asya's groan was enough to tell him that neither he nor anyone nor anything at all would be able to convince her. Well, it was a rhetorical question, obviously. She's not asking for, him to solve her problems. She just wants him to listen. So, note to Dyomka. But he seems to already know there was nothing to live for now. Even if he could have done, Asya's groan was enough to tell him that neither he nor anyone, nor anything at all, would be able to convince her. Her own experience led to only one conclusion. There was nothing to live for now. "Who in the world would want me now?" She stumbled the words out inconsolably. "Who in the world?" She buried her face in his pillow once again. Dyomka's cheek was by now quite wet. "Well, he was still trying to soothe her. still clasping her hand. "You know how people get married. They have the same sort of opinions, the same sort of characters. What sort of fool loves a girl for her character?" She started up angrily, like a horse rearing. She pulled her hand away, and Dyomka saw her face for the first time. Wet, flushed, blotched, miserable and angry. "Who wants a girl with one breast? Who wants a girl like that? When she's 17? She shouted the words at him. It was all his fault. He didn't know how to console her. "How will I be able to go to the beach?" she shrieked, as a new thought pierced her. "The beach! How can I go swimming?" Her body corkscrewed, then crumpled. Her head clutched between her hands. She slumped down from Dyomka toward the floor. Unbearably, she began to imagine bathing suits in different styles, with or without shoulder straps, one-piece or two-piece, every contemporary and future fashion, bathing suits in orange and blue, crimson and the hue of the sea, in one color, or striped, with scalloped edges, bathing suits she hadn't yet tried on but had examined in front of a mirror, all the ones she would never buy and never wear. She could never show herself on the beach again. It had suddenly struck her as the most excruciating, the most mortifying fact of her existence. Living had lost all meaning, and this was the reason why. Dyomka mumbled something clumsy and inept from his pile of pillows. "Of course, you know, if no one will have you, well, of course, I realize what sort of man I am now, but I'll always be happy to marry you, you know that. Listen to me, Dyomka." A new thought had stung Asya. She stood up, faced him, and looked straight at him. Her eyes were wide open and fearless. "Listen to me. You will be the last one. You're the last one who can see it and kiss it. No one but you will ever kiss it. Dyomka, you, at least, must kiss it, if nobody else." She pulled her dressing gown apart. It wasn't holding together anyway. It seemed to him that she was weeping and groaning again as she pulled down the loose collar of her nightdress to reveal her doomed right breast. It shone as though the sun had stepped straight into the room. The whole ward seemed on fire. The nipple glowed. It was larger than he had ever imagined. It stood before him. His eyes could not resist its sunny rosiness. Asya brought it close to his face and held it for him. Kiss it, she demanded. She stood there waiting and breathing in the warmth her body was offering him. He nuzzled it with his lips like a suckling pig, gratefully, admiringly. Nothing more beautiful than this gentle curve could ever be painted or sculptured. Its beauty flooded him. Hurriedly, his lips took in its even shapely contour. You'll remember, won't you? You'll remember it was there, and what it was like. Asya's tears kept dropping onto his close-cropped head. When she did not take it away, he returned to its rosy glow again, and again, softly kissing the breast. He did what her future child would never be able to do. No one came in, and so he kissed and kissed the marvel hanging over him. Today, it was a marvel. Tomorrow, it would be in the trash bin. Well, shit. That's the end of chapter 28, and, well, that sucks. But it looks like Dyomka's getting laid tonight by Asya, which is good. It's a good thing for Dyomka. I mean, to be honest, I don't think it's such a huge deal. So what if she has one breast? Wouldn't matter to me. But I don't know. You know, some people are butt people, some people are breast people, and no one likes having stuff cut off of their body. Either way, Dyomka's getting laid, and that's the end of chapter 28. This is the Carter Banks Hour. If you want to hear the previous chapters of this book, all 27 of them, plus this one, I'll leave a link below, maybe in the description or something. Check it out. Maybe I'll do one of those little bubbles that pops up right here, and, maybe it'll be like a playlist or something. But anyway, I will be back to read chapter 29 tomorrow at 9 p.m. Central Time. Thanks for tuning in, and stay safe.